Good evening, everyone. My name is Christopher Cody. I'm the Associate Dean of Research Education here at the Conservatorium of Music, Sydney Conservatorium of Music, and I welcome you all to our second Hook Lecture of 2023 to be given by Professor Roger Dean, Professor of Sonic Communication at the Marx Institute for Brain Behavior and Development, Western Sydney University. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of this place and Aboriginal sovereignty of country. All of the music we make in this building is performed on country that has for millennia been a site of knowledge exchange and cultural practice for Australia's first people. All that we do here is situated in relation to that fundamental fact. And it's a privilege to work and create on country that knows culture so deeply. I pay my respect to Aboriginal elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people here tonight. The Sydney Conservatorium of Music is one of the most dynamic research institutions for music in Australia. Our research extends across a wide range of subdisciplines in music, from Western classical to Indigenous and non-Western musics, jazz, contemporary, popular, and music improvisation. We support artistic research, music diversity, musicology, and music education, and we foster strong collaborations with key multidisciplinary institutions at the University of Sydney, including the Sydney Environment Institute, the Brain and Mind Centre, the China Studies Centre, Sydney Nano, and the Charles Perkins Centre. We also host Paradisic, a world-class digital archive of records from the many cultures of the Pacific region and beyond. Some words about Alfred Samuel Hooke, the namesake of tonight's Hooke Lecture. Alfred Hooke was a practicing architect who believed architecture, like music, was an art vital to people's prosperity. He helped found the University of Sydney's Faculty of Architecture in 1918, from which he retired as dean in 1949. Hooke's other great love was music. He gave lunch hour talks on the history of music, illustrated by the university's collection of gramophone records. He was a member of the university's choral group, and as a keen organist, was associated with installing the university's War Memorial Carillon in 1928 and founding the Department of Music in 1948. The Alfred Hooke Lecture is made possible through a generous bequest from Doreen Robson. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Professor Roger Dean. I've often thought that if I was ever lucky enough to have the opportunity to introduce Roger, I might start with a little joke, a slow roll of his incredible accomplishments, founder of the new music ensembles Lysis in the UK in 1970 and Australisis in Sydney in 1990, director of the Heart Research Institute in Sydney from 1988 to 2002, Vice Chancellor and President of the University of Canberra from 2002 to 2007, and during this slow roll of accomplishments, I might make one or two up to see if anything would be interpreted as a bridge too far for Roger. Professor of Sonic Communication at the Marx Institute for Brain Behavior and Development, winner with Will Lures and Hazel Smith of the Robert Coover Prize of the Electronic Literature Organization in 2018, Academy Award for Best Actor in the critically acclaimed 1994 film Forrest Gump, and current Chief Investigator of the Australian Research Council funded project to map and enhance Australian musical improvisation as a creative industry. I won't tell you which of those items was fabricated. My point is really that Roger is an incredible polymath, and that there's simply too much to say about his contributions to knowledge and culture. And in order to narrow things down to a manageable frame, I'd like to say some words about Roger's contribution to the soundscapes within this building. The sounds of Australisis have echoed in the halls of this conservatorium for over 30 years. I'm pretty sure that the first performance Roger gave with Australisis at the conservatorium was on the 21st of June, 1990. On that winter night, more than 33 years ago, the ensemble presented a program titled Text, Sound, Music, that included performances of Ernie Althos's work, Insert Point to Operate, composed of spoken text with the nouns removed, thank you very much, a rendering of Peter Sculthorpe's graphic score, Dream, and a composition by Jackson Mac Lowe, in which phonemes of written texts were linked according to predetermined patterns and pictures interpreted by the instrumentalists. Graham Skinner, witness to this first concert, remarked just 2 months later that with the end of their first full concert season, Australisis have proved themselves an indispensable, rejuvenating force in avant-garde music in Sydney. And so it goes. Dubbed an improvising apostle by Gail Brennan in 1993, Roger's creative work in music has routinely sought to expand the possibilities of improvisatory practices in music and broaden audience engagement with new sound worlds. One of my favorite accounts of an Australisis performance in this building is of a program that was titled Jazz and Sound in 5D, delivered in Recital Hall West, the other recital hall, on 2nd of October 2004, nearly 20 years ago. Sydney Morning Herald jazz critic John Shand proclaimed the improvised performance an assault on the senses from every direction, intensely interactive improvising that had sound swirling about the room, shattered by sudden blasts akin to an unexpected low-flying aircraft. But, as readers would learn, in the best possible way, a thrilling and magical performance of ricocheting bullets. Tonight, I'm sure we'll experience some of that magic again as we welcome Roger back to the Conservatorium recital halls to deliver a lecture recital about culture, transformation, and music. Keenly interested in not only what we hear, but why we hear what we hear the way we do, Roger's work as a music scholar spans the domains of music cognition and computation, which in turn fold into the way he has pioneered new compositional and improvisatory spaces. It is a genuine pleasure to have Roger with us tonight to illuminate these entwined worlds. Please join me in making him feel welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris, for all the effort you put into preparing that. It was a bit overwhelming, but it's a pleasure to be here, to return to the con, as you say. The con did ask me to fulfill one or two agendas in this talk, and which I'm going to try and do while still making it approachable. They mentioned an interest in talking about how members of this institution might think about creativity in their work, as well as how we, the listening music public at large, might. So I'm going to try and do that. And in the process, in trying to make it approachable, I've done two things. I'm going to brush over quite a few complexities. Feel free to ask about them afterwards or discuss them. I'm also just occasionally going to delve a bit more deeply into something. If it gets a bit tedious, just switch off. Very soon thereafter, there'll be an audio or visual example. I've got 9 of those, which take 10 minutes in total, so you won't be far away from one of those at any point. So I hope that will keep you engaged for the purpose. Let's go. So, as I say, I appreciate this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let's just think about a musical performer, such as many of my friends and professional peers here in this institution. And also, what Chris didn't say is that I love playing in a lot of different contexts. And I've played in groups ranging from the Academy of Ancient Music to the London Sinfonietta to global jazz orchestras, Graham Collier music, all sorts of things. So I like a lot of different experiences. So let's think about what it's like to be a performer facing various kinds of music. And I want to show you a couple of examples to get started. Listen a bit to the left-hand chords. So as you might have known, that was Glenn Gould. The Webern variations were written in 1936, so this is a long time ago, but it's a very distinct kind of musical style, rather different from conventional tonality, conventional Western music, both of today and of that period. And I mentioned the left hand because when we come to the third item I'm going to play you, you'll notice a certain commonality, what's called quartal harmony. Here's the second example I want us to think about. So I'm particularly interested in the attitude and potentials for the performer in what's going on. That one, of course, illustrates the relationship between social strata and musical presentation and appreciation, the role of the audience as well as that of the performer in an Indian tradition. And then just notice how the left-hand chords here have a lot in common with the first item. So McCoy Tyner, the pianist, is using what's called quartal harmony, in which the notes of usually a three-note chord in the left hand are 4 to 6 semitones apart, 4 to 6 steps on the piano. And in all those pieces, I think one of the interesting things is that there's a formula, there's a preformed melody, there's preformed structure, and it is being either drastically elaborated in the second and third, or it is being minutely interpreted, added gesture, added expression in the first. So the general point there, of course, is that there's a huge array of potential for what is appreciated by a performer and by an audience when we have sophisticated music. So my argument today is really that all of us, be we performers, improvisers, or composers, share with audiences most of the list of things I've got there, which are about interpretation, about juxtaposition, about the way that we present music to the audience, presenting it in a variety of ways, juxtaposing it in a variety of ways, so as to get cohesion of understanding, sometimes perhaps cohesion of social interaction as well, but certainly potential variety of interpretation and therefore, in my mind, expressive experience, affective experience. The other thing that the con asked me to address, besides the things I've alluded to already, was how I relate my interest in creativity to my overall research strategy. So this is the main slide which summarizes that before I get to the more specific things about creativity in music. So I'm particularly interested in music's affect and how that operates on a continuous basis. I mean, I don't feel that we listen to a piece of music and then at the end say, that was exciting or that was depressing or whatever it is. I think we continuously change our affective responses as it goes along. So I'm interested in how that works. So we do studies where we make attempts to measure people's impression of what's going on, and we try to interpret them with models. And we also do minute experiments about specific musical components like pitch, rhythm, timbre, structure that I'm going to talk about more. So those kind of models that we generate of the data we get can be informative about how one as a composer might want to work, how one might want to expand by breaking the model, and they also allow experimental approaches, such as one where you manipulate a specific component of a musical piece and see how it influences the affective responses that you measure. So that's bringing us down to the third of the points on this slide. And the final one then is, more generally, how could we use all those sort of things to make music? And my argument here is that if you have a model of how a piece works, then you have an algorithm which is potentially a generative tool. If you have I'll come back later to machine learning and AI, where you have a different kind of model. And it could be that you want to manipulate the way that you make the composition with a view to a certain perceptual or cognitive output. And then the arrow coming back up the side, of course, is to indicate this is a cycle. You can go through this repeatedly and try to view different aspects of affect and music's interaction. So one diversion which was intended to meet the requested brief from the Conservatorium was just to talk about the research creative divide, the difference between thinking about researching music on the one hand and creating it on the other, and particularly thinking about creative in the artistic context. Because, of course, if you make a definition of research, like the OECD, you almost inevitably use the word creative right at the beginning or somewhere important. So they say it's creative work undertaken for a certain set of purposes. So you've already co-aligned the two things, the creative work, be it artistic or be it scientific, and the research work. And so there have been a lot of problems flowing from this. In Australia, for example, in 2018, the government had its reporting mechanism in higher education. This is the Herdker specifications. Oh yes, you can see my cursor, good. The Herdker specifications were the mechanism by which we reported to government about research in universities. And there was one sensible thing here, that ideally research could use to results that could be reproduced and be transferable or reproducible. I don't really object to that. I think that's a nice ideal even for creative work. But they then said artistic performance or expression does not meet the definition of research and development. This was 2018. And this was about the third reversal of government policy on this, which was singularly depressing for artists and artistic creator. We would like to say, as the definition implies, artistic work is in itself a contribution to research. They were saying, cheerio, no thank you. However, as in a lot of these things, there's some sign of light from time to time, and the current draft says quite the opposite, and says, hopefully, we're going to recognise it again. So we can only applaud this and hope that they mean what they say in the draft. And to a limited degree, I think the work of people like Bolton Barrett in Australia and Hazel Smith and I here too has been a push towards that recognition that creative work is important in its own right, but that it can interact with research and there can be productive exchanges. So we did a polemic book in 2009 towards that purpose, which has been very widely cited and quite highly used. I think it has contributed a little bit towards those reversals that I just mentioned. So behind the model of there being an interaction between research and creative things at large, of course, has to be a model of creative work per se in any field. And this is a very simple but very influential model that is worth thinking about. So clearly, if you're going to have novelty of output, which is one of the main criteria by which you might assess creativity, then you've got to generate a set of ideas, you've got to explore them. You may well choose to erase some from further consideration on the grounds that you can't consider everything under the sun and that you don't like it. But you could nevertheless have an expanding pool of ideas which you, the creator, view as potentially useful, either because it will allow you to have a new scientific theory or a new creative work. Then you do some selection and re-evaluation, and you keep on cycling through this process. And this model has been quite influential in an artistic field called A-Life, and artificial A-Life has actually been one of the areas in which, in my mind, there was a slight deficiency. While emphasizing diversity and the analogy of selection to Darwinian selection, biological selection, they actually allowed the continuation of this idea of erasure. So by erasure, I mean removing completely as opposed to deciding not to use. And so I developed a model for music composition, which is a very slight transformation of that. Look at the gemsy bit in the middle, which just adds maintain diversity. In other words, keep in your stock of potential things everything that has come up, and don't necessarily, of course, use it all, but keep it there, don't just dismiss it. So this merely places the musical processes of sonic material and constructing larger structure from them in the context of that general Jean-Claude model, and reminds us that we need to think about relationships between cognition, that is how the audience or how the composer or improviser is thinking about things as they make or receive them, and we also need to include concepts of social mediation, how secondary parties like, say, the ABC, and my colleague Simon Chambers has done great work on this, how these secondary influences sometimes even dominate what is presented as being the whole field of music and neglecting a large part of it. So I would like us to fight to maintain that diversity, and I think Chris's introduction about the Australisis programs of 30 years ago shows you that I've always been trying to do that in our programming, and I think that should be encouraged and supported. So this is the model that we came up to in that book, Hazel and I, And I won't go into detail, but you can see that at the top we have the idea of idea generation, of course shared with the Jean-Claude model. And we talk about it both in relation to research, where the fundamental objective is to try to gain some understanding of something, but equally we refer to it in relation to creative practice, where the objective might be scientifically to create new ideas, but it might also be artistically to create expressive works. So we go through a process of researching things which flow from creative practice on the right-hand side, come back down the bottom to where the two come together, the research stream from the left and the creative stream from the right, and where we might have an interaction, which I like to call research-led practice. The idea that some research about something fundamental about music cognition, music perception, music computation can flow into the creative process. So I just want to give you a few examples of this before I get to my thrust about general approaches to creativity, which I think can be particularly useful in music. So I've already alluded to evolutionary science and its connection with A Life, and there's a great book, it's a bit old now, by Mitchell Whitelaw, published by MIT, Metacreation, which I can thoroughly recommend as a survey up till then. There are several books later, but I think his gives an intellectual frame which is powerful and still applicable. There are examples in tuning systems, which I'll come to a bit more. There's the example of cognition of loudness, where we have quite a decent understanding now of how the brain recognizes loudness, and it seems to be very important in music. Again, I'll come back to it. And we know rather less, but there is example work about timbre and about how those might be applied in AI, machine learning. In the multimedia field, there was some great stuff years ago by Simon Biggs, who's now in Adelaide, an Australian come British artist, computational and empirical sound and linguistics. And I'm very fond of the work of Keith Armstrong, who's particularly ecosophically driven. He's in Queensland. And so I just want to make a distinction here in a very crude way. This is an example of simplification between an algorithm, which is a defined method for achieving a defined or at least predictable range of purposes, such as the data models I alluded to already, and on the other hand, machine learning, where really the algorithm is applied to a learning process which then becomes almost a black box, no longer a transparent, defined algorithm to predict things and generate things. Both very interesting, but very different. I'll come back to those too. So just as an example of how some of those ideas which relate science of evolution and selection to creative processes, this is a bit of an example of a piece, multimedia piece, as mentioned by these three authors, including myself, which uses recombination. So this is recombination somewhat in the Darwinian sense, but without a selective or a mutational step in it. Nevertheless, it uses the analogy, and there's a complete coding of the process. And the trumpet playing at the end, by the way, is by fantastic Scottish trumpet player who actually co-founded Lysis with me, John Wallace, was the principal of the Royal College of Music in Scotland for a long while. So those were some examples of how scientific ideas have influenced creative work in music. Here's a couple of examples about humanities research as leading to creative work. So as you can appreciate, I'm talking here about the research-led practice component of that diagram of mine. So a lot of work presented on the ABC's former fantastic radio series, The Listening Room, involved quite detailed historical or sociological work informing the pieces. Many of you, I'm sure, would have heard some of those broadcasts. They're beginning to be repeatedly available now online too. They were for a long time missing. And then if we think about the Canadian Soundscape Project, R. Murray Schafer's work, this was essentially an effort to make the listening public as well as the creative musical community aware of the sound spaces of all the environments in which we live and work, and to realize them a bit in a Cagean fashion as being expressive potentially or already. And so a lot of things have flowed from that project, which I think are very important, and I suppose you could say Keith Armstrong's efforts that I mentioned already follow that. And then a more specific example flows from Hazel's work on Frank O'Hara, where the gossip element of his work became an information flow towards a piece that we did called The Erotics of Gossip, which was on The Listening Room, if I remember rightly. And then when we think about our indigenous community, there have been some fantastic pieces trying to appreciate some of their intellectual contributions, for example, their awareness of astronomy and their interpretations of it long before many Western people started thinking about it. And so his Calling to Come is an example of that. And Keith's work Finitude that I contributed to is another. And let me just, again, personalize towards Australysis and myself briefly. Hazel's monograph about the music-literature relationship introduced the concept of the voicescape, which was an idea of spoken voices having a choir-like expressive function, so a polyphony, and we used that in several works. And then we subsequently transformed voicescapes more extensively, digitally. On The Listening Room, we didn't do so much of that. It was a choral, if you like, choir-like voicescape of text. Subsequently, we used a lot of digital transformations of them in these two works mentioned here. And then these are more like general ideas that have flown into our work. I'll come back to deep learning. That's an example of machine learning, AI. We've been particularly interested in a statistical technique for modeling the temporal nature of music progression, time series analysis, which led to models. I made a musical model called Bang, the beat and note generator, which was based on time series models. We're also interested in how information flow in music can be computed. My colleague Marcus Pearce in London has been a pioneer in that, and we've used that towards algorithmic music from time to time. And then you'll hear a little bit more about rhythm generation and Andy Milne's chronomorph and Stefan Herf's in a minute. And I've been interested in scale systems. Again, let me come back to them. And Greg White I wanted to mention here, automatic score generation. We did several works of his which allowed automatic score generation in the 1990s. So the performer was faced with a changing score. I'll illustrate it in just a second. And then Sandy Evans, our saxophonist, you'll see her in a minute, has taken a huge interest in Indian music and how it might be related to improvisation in general and the jazz tradition here in particular. And then I've also, in my collaboration with soprano trombone player Torbjörn Hultmark in the UK, developed some novel sonic morphing mechanisms, again, all flowing from research-led thoughts. So this is Greg's interface for the glass bead game, one of those pieces I just mentioned, where a score is projected and the performer not only has to realize those, but has to improvise upon them, and the degree to which they fulfill the requirements of the harmony, range, dynamics, and density implied by the score are monitored computationally such that when, for example, the density gets too low, below the benchmark required in this case, where the dots are, then the computational element flows in this case with some more note provision to complement what's being performed. And this is quite a stimulating challenge for a performer. We did another one which doesn't have that kind of interaction, but has a score generation which you have no previous experience of, and that creates a novel challenge too. And this is an example of applying those ideas more widely to create a virtual rhythm section. So you're going to hear a bit of jazz improvisation by Sandy Evans and myself, but the rhythm section is algorithmic. And you'll see in the middle of the video, you'll see a flick over to focus on Sandy, and just to the right there is Greg, in the right, near the middle of the screen, in the right of the left-hand image. There's Greg making the rhythm section. So now I want to come to the argument about how we can expand music creation in general. And so the main proposition is really a very simple one, that I think that we can get benefit from a lot of different perspectives from interrogating each of the key musical elements as we perceive them. I perceive them particularly in form of these 5 elements here, but there are a lot of other ways of formulating this, of course, and the same idea that I'm putting forward can be applied in principle to any approach. And also that does imply to me that from any culture one could adopt this kind of approach, and one could adopt it to get some new algorithmic methods, to get some new machine learning methods, and to get virtual improvisers and virtual instruments, as I've just illustrated. So I want to make one distinction between the kinds of components that music has that may be useful. That is that there are certain sonic stimuli which seem to have inevitable correlates in the brain and probably beyond simply sensation. We tend to call those psychoacoustic features. And the most important one in terms of musical generation and perception is almost certainly changing loudness. In every culture, changing loudness is a salient feature, even though the scale on which it operates may vary across cultures. It's a salient feature of musical expression. And in most spectral aspects, that is timbral, tone quality aspects, are also important. And this is probably because of their fundamental psychoacoustic impacts. But on the other hand, with exposure and statistical and social experience, we become tuned to certain things and in a sense detuned to some of the things which were within our potentials to begin with. But the good thing is it's a mutable detuning or entuning, intuning. So we've got a perspective which modifies our basic psychoacoustic perceptions according to our current experience. And I take that to be a benefit, especially if one's aware of it and tries to exploit it. So these are approaches to extending music which can be applied to those 5 categories that I've talked about, and I'll give brief examples from each category in just a second. And this is work that I've been doing with Sandy. So many of the musical components that I delineated there tend to be viewed as if they were a set of discontinuous categories. But actually that's not necessary in most cases, certainly not with pitch. The pitch is on the piano. They could be continuous. Another area where we tend to think in a narrow rather than a broad way is the area of thinking about sequential temporal structure. And most music has many aspects which you could only describe as linear. That is, there is a logical projection where something immediately predicts what should happen in the following half a minute, say. And that's where time series analysis is very useful, because it postulates that. But on the other hand, there's no reason, as we can observe with the discontinuities on the web, that we couldn't have non-linearity. And similarly, that we couldn't overlay things which are quite disparate as opposed to things which are already continuous, already related. So those are things which, to me, are potentially worth thinking about in every context, because quite likely they would imply novel hierarchies. Music does tend to be viewed in a hierarchical way, whether or not we appreciate the idea that there's a tonal center and there might be a return to it, or whether or not we view that there's a rhythmic structure which is going to resolve at some point to a consensus emphasized point, a beat, for example, within a meter. So decoordination of those normally coordinated events and resequencing, making them into web network structures, to me is a very important thing. And Chris was bringing up with me when we were talking earlier before that I just published a paper which takes a network analysis approach to perceiving timbre, which is not normally how one approaches it. Normally how the science of timbre perception operates is to try and look at distances between different timbres as if they were fixed. My idea is they can be mutable, and so they form a web rather than just a disposition in space. So if I take these 5 different arbitrary, agreed, subsets of musical components, let's just look at them each briefly and see to what degree we can challenge them with those kind of ideas I've put. And in most cases, I think we can reasonably challenge them with all of them. So in the case of rhythm, we need to take into account that in most Western music, rhythm is very, very simple. It comprises essentially duple or triple meters which can be divided by 2 or 3. In fact, I went to a conference run by Ritmo, which is the Norwegian research centre concerned with rhythm. And of the 40 talks there were or so, I would say that all but 2 treated rhythm as if it was simply one regular pulse. It didn't even treat it as if it had emphasized pulses, like a 4/4 bar that I'm now delineating. It was very, very simple, and that's been a limitation in music perception research, I'm afraid, but it doesn't need to be, and nor does it need to be a limitation in creation of music. We can have complicated rhythms, multiple beat lengths, meters which are not symmetric, which have, say, 3/3/2, not just 2/2/2/2. We can have different beat lengths. Because of that, we can have different beat lengths because the pulses have different rates. And these are things that I'll just allude to again in a second in relation to chronomorph. And I'm going to play at the end of my talk something related to Couperin, Louis Couperin, from around about 1650. And he had this idea, which was essentially a codification of an improvisation approach of an unmeasured prelude. So it's a prelude which has some notated pitches. The sequence is specified, but the timings are completely unspecified. And as you can see down the bottom here, we, together with my colleagues in Montreal, we did an interesting study about how professional harpsichordists choose to perform this and how their choices relate to the information flow of the piece. Quite an interesting study, I thought. And certainly I love the particular piece I'm going to play, and you'll see why it challenges conventions of rhythm. I didn't need to do that, obviously. And music without a pulse is something I've also taken an interest in more recently, and together with my colleagues, another group of colleagues in Montreal, I've also participated in some of the analyses of a study about timelessness that they made. And Gérard Grisset was one of the main topics. He's a fantastic French spectral timbral electroacoustic composer, and he has some pieces where he believes that he can control the degree of timelessness that people experience, and the empirical evidence from this study of Jason Noble and I and Stephen McAdams was actually in support of that, much to my amazement. So I think that we need to think about temporal flow without necessarily it having a rhythmic overtone, as well as thinking about rhythm. And I was interested in these kind of complex rhythms a long time ago. This is just a max patch that I had used in the 90s, where the left-hand side generates a regular pulse, fixed pulse, so it can be changed at any moment. And this bit down here generates syncopations, which can be at any point subdividing those pulses. Then the right-hand side generates initially a superimposed pulse, which is an integral, multiple of the left-hand pulse, but soon gets transformed to be any ratio. So we can have non-integer pulse multipliers. And I found that quite intriguing to play with. And it also relates to some of the incredibly nifty idea within chronomorph, which my colleagues Andy and Stefan developed. It's an application you can get for nothing on the web. It's been used by many, many people. And I'm not going to go into it in detail beyond saying that this purple bit here is a you can't really see it well enough there, can you? But there is a purple structure here which represents the rhythmic structure. Sorry about that. I did point out to our friends that some of these slides were a bit light, but they need the light for the filming, so apologies for that. The point I wanted to make was that this is all setting up some instruments on the right-hand side. There are presets that you can choose from on the right-hand side. And then there are two sliders here, one of which determines the duration of a cyclic pattern, and the other of which determines ratios between the components therein. It's fascinating to play with. I recommend it. And here's a little bit of us playing it. So I'm just using a patch which drives continuously a change in both those parameters of chronomorph, and Sandy over here on the left is improvising with it in several different ways, you'll notice if you look carefully. So the rhythmic cycle duration changes eventually, and the pattern changes almost from the word go. Nothing was happening on that computer that you saw on the right-hand side, by the way. It's a bit of a filmmaker's ploy. And just a couple of videos I've shown from our performances, they're available in a series of videos which are on the Australian Music Centre site and elsewhere, called The Art of the Music of Science, the Science of Music. A lot of different music and discussion there from my colleagues at Marx Institute and from members of Australisis. You can get it from several places if you want. So continuing from rhythm to dynamics. So I've mentioned that loudness change is a very dominant influence. It's probably an influence in every music culture that's been studied. So then one might ask, well, are there universal patterns in how those organizations of loudness happen in music? I don't know about universal, but there's evidence that rises in dynamic tend to be shorter than falls, and that's something one could disrupt, clearly. Part of that is probably due to the common way that string playing involves little bulges on the attack of a sound, and it's not so uncommon in wind playing as well. But that only explains some of it on a very short time frame. On a longer time frame, there are other things in play, and we don't know fully the range of musical cultures in which it applies, but it certainly applies in Western music, in Japanese music, in African American music, and some Indian music. It hasn't been studied widely enough. So again, it's something that one could challenge, something one can exploit. And then as I'm implying at the bottom end, can one relate the different ways it's used in different contexts in such a way as to make a new usage of dynamics? That's wide open to my mind. Coming to the third component, timbre, we don't even know really, in my opinion, whether there is a systematically different usage of and perception of timbre across cultures. We do know, of course, that there are unique instruments in different cultures and they have very different sounds. That's a slightly different matter. Is there a different usage? Is that timbral field in a whole work substantially different? I don't think that's been very carefully studied, and I do think it'd be a very interesting thing. There's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that consonance perception is something which is fairly widely shared. That's the difference between whether a chord is kind of jangly or whether it's clear and relaxed. This is putting it very crudely. There are also differences which we've been studying with Elena Smith and Andy again in PNG, where some aspects of perception of contrast between pairs of sound, for example, seem to be in common with Western listeners, and other aspects seem to be distinct for the PNG locals. And this is an issue which is, again, inadequately studied and becoming increasingly difficult to study because of the statistical exposure increasing across the world to our uniform monotony of certain kinds of Western music. Then there's the question of how the timbres might be used compositionally, whether there might be a different approach to harnessing timbral contrasts. Again, we don't know that much about it, but there are some very interesting things about improvising timbral shifts. I was interested very much in using the DX7 when it came out in 1984 as a live timbral shift instrument. I did that in some jazz groups in 1985, and now, of course, the opportunities are far greater and far more exciting than they were then. But even then, one could shock fairly readily with some of the sounds that could be made. So timbral change, computational or manual, is an extremely interesting thing. It's a core of noise improvisation. And there are some beautiful new instruments like Andrew McPherson's magnetic resonator piano, which uses the resonance of a piano to generate a whole complex of sounds beyond those you could play directly on the strings. So I think a lot of things remain to be both exploited compositionally, in spite of wonderful stuff from Xenakis and Grisey and others, Wishart. A lot of things to remain exploited in timbre that we can conceivably approach. And as I mentioned in that footnote there, I think also it's fairly apparent that timbral things which are from a culture other than one's own are not a big problem, are not, shall we say, disturbing or perturbing. They may be noticeable, but certainly some timbres dramatically changed in drones on one of Sandy Evans' albums that I contributed did not create any waves with the musicians. So coming to the fourth of my 5 items, pitch. I like to think of pitch as a subset of timbre because the way that we understand pitch cognitively is still incompletely understood, but it is about spectral patterns, and the pitch that we imagine to be part of the tone may or may not be sounded. It might be virtual pitch, but it's due to the complex of the whole spectrum of the timbre which is going on that we have that perception, it seems. So, as is obvious on a piano, you've got usually 88 keys, but there's no reason there couldn't be an infinity of pitches. And so we've got every possibility we might want to exploit that. Probably as I play the piece at the end, that'll happen. And you've heard a little bit of that already in the video I showed. There's a huge dominance of octaves, that is where frequency ratios are 2 to 1 in theory, but even pianos are mistuned in relation to that very commonly. So it's a bit of a figment, even though it's a very useful one, and it's part of the battles which Couperin and Bach and so on fought about whether we should have a conventional mean temperament, equal temperament, or whether we should have freer fluxes. There's a difficulty in having the absolute lovely harmonic spectrum which idealized in equal temperament, because you have to have absolute physical uniformity of the objects generating the sound, and that basically doesn't happen. This is the problem of tuning on brass instruments, for example. Very, very difficult to achieve the uniformity which would be required for an ideal spectrum. But, of course, the brass instruments, quite a few of them have slides. The soprano trombone has slides, which is nice. Trumpet does not, generally. There are slide trumpets. Whereas, of course, sliding up and down a string instrument is a routine thing. Glissandi, pitch, flux is perfectly normal there. Very, very important in Indian music, less so in ours. So again, plenty of things within pitch to challenge. And there are, interestingly, relatively few unorthodox tuning systems. I mean, there are 5,000 different scale systems in the Scala database, 5,500 and something. I contributed 2. And the differences between them are mostly not about tuning, but some of them are. Some of them don't use octaves, not many of them. And scales, of course, are when you've got your set of pitches available, you've already categorized, like on the piano, and you decide which are going to be the emphasized notes, not necessarily all of them. So scales are a different matter from tuning, but of course the two overlap. If you have a repeating tuning structure like the piano really only has one pitch relationship. That is, 2 adjacent keys are always a given fixed multiplier apart, the 12th root of 2 approximately. But of course you can play notes that are 3 apart or 5 apart. But nevertheless, there's one common thing there. We don't need to have that. So multiphonic virtual pitch instruments is something that appeal to me, and of course electroacoustic music, percussion, downplay tuning. So we don't need to be too bound by it. Here's a little example of one tuning system which is equal tempered, has regular steps, but you'll hear it sounds very different from ours. That's a tuning system which has a repeating structure at every octave and a half, as opposed to every octave like most of our Western systems. And this is an illustration of, I won't elaborate the technical details of this measure here, but it's about the size of the tuning system, in a sense. Most have a size of 12, like the octave system on a piano. And up here at 81 and 91 are 2 of my systems, which don't have any repeating pitch intervals. All the intervals are different. And there are very few tuning systems like that within this structure. This is summarizing the Scala database that I already referred to. So lastly, surveying the higher level structures, and this is really simplistic because, of course, higher level structures in music are potentially very, very complicated, and I'm only referring to quite simple things about it. But you have to go, of course, from single pitches to melodies and to harmony, and think about how each of those might vary across cultures, might be transformed, might be appreciated. And there's a lovely classic paper by Shepard saying something rather appealing to me, that people can rapidly learn different melodic structures in different tuning systems. He compared Balinese and American listeners in relation to stimuli from both places. And Balinese music, as you might know, has a tuning system in which usually every pitch has another associated pitch which is very close to it, going on in parallel, unlike what we have. So harmonic organization is the next level, and one of the things which I've enjoyed in the past is using slightly unorthodox versions of inversion. So inversion is something like going from a chord like that to one like that to one like that. But another thing one can do is, of course, use the same approach but go where the top one is that and the bottom one is that, same structure, or one could go And even simple things like that have been relatively, I'd say, underexploited, not carefully thought about. There was one occasion on which I was playing in a jazz group which was very keen on vamps in which a particular harmonic structure is repeated. And so after a while I decided I'd had enough of this, and I kept on playing it, but at the same time using the approach I've just illustrated. Luckily the band leader didn't really notice, but most of the other musicians did and thought this was quite amusing. It was a bit of a naughty thing to do, but the point is it was a way of providing a stimulating harmonic transformation which resulted in some different music. So again, we have possibilities of different structures being observed in different musics, and I think it's clear that if you like the idea that large-scale Western music has a narrative, then the narrative in Hindustani rag is very different. And Chowdhury, that I alluded to in the footnotes of one of the other slides, has some very interesting writing about this. Then we've obviously got possibilities for non-linearities, web-like structures that I mentioned. We've got a discussion about different narrative structures between European music and African-American music. George Lewis has written in a nuanced fashion about that. It's very interesting, and I think the concepts of those different kinds of approaches are worth thinking about. And then, can we be fundamentally exploratory towards these features? Why not? We've got every right to. Postmodernism encourages us towards that. So at this level, I think there are huge areas still. Of course, there are myriads of explorations, but huge open areas. So I might be very brief about machine learning, but just to mention that machine learning allows one to have different representations of music. So you could say that defining each of the notes of the piano as a MIDI pitch number is a representation. But when you've got a machine-learned model, even that was trained that way, the fields that it represents in different layers of a model are actually very different. And so one can interrogate those layers. And there's a nice synthesizer made by Google called NSynth, which does exactly that. It allows you to move across sonic fields in a way which is quite different from that one would do by simply varying, for example, the frequency spectrum. And so, in general, I think machine learning has potential for us to find novel fields which we can explore. So rather than just having different bodies of knowledge represented by different musical corpora and trying to get a kind of consensus or a compromise between them to predict new stuff, we can actually have a model which knows about both of these corpora, knows about their independent nature, and you move between them or even potentially beyond them. NSynth doesn't allow you to go beyond them in my present assessment of it, but it does allow you to go within, and I'm developing models, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but I'm developing models which allow one to go beyond. So the last example is just showing machine learning being coupled to a particular musical purpose. You could hear that it's post-minimal with that regular repetition and transforming of the melody. You could also hear it's a slightly weird tuning system. And we do the same sort of thing with text in Australysis. In the middle of this one is composed text by Hazel. And the left-hand side is a very naive machine learning model generating stuff. And in the right-hand side is a slightly less naive model generating stuff. And of course, we've got quite sophisticated models that make semi-poetic stuff which is more syntactic or more controlled in its non-syntacticality than that, a bit like ChatGPT. And this is doing the same thing algorithmically as opposed to machine learning in a piece we did a long time ago. So, to wrap up, I've supported the idea that we should explore every possible avenue of interrogating the musical materials we use, computationally, algorithmically, and performatively. And I would hope that this is something that listeners might want to try and do as well. I just comment here that evaluation of expression, of course, is quite a different matter from pursuing novelty and assessing it. And I'm not dismissing in any way the importance of that. I'm just pointing out that from an empirical point of view, it's actually very complicated and very difficult to do, and it's not commonly done terribly well, but it's important. But for a creator, their judgment is the one that counts. I think there are reasons to be optimistic about pro-social impacts of taking these approaches which bring cultural features together, providing one does it with the agreement of the participants and if they come from different cultures. I think there is a current wish to be idealistic about that and think that we already know that these pro-social impacts and health impacts really happen. I think it's much more insecure, our knowledge of that, than it seems, but very potential and very important. And as I said, I think these are practical implications that both performers and composers and audience can share if they want to make the effort, take the interest, think about these kind of things, think about what it is about music that appeals to them, and sometimes interrogate that. So I hope if some of you are non-creators of music or non-performers, you might want to do that, just as I hope that we performers and creators do too. So thank you very much. These are just acknowledgements of the main people that I've been collaborating with that have influenced what I'm saying recently. And just forgive me a second while I set up, and I'll play a short piece which will illustrate some of those features. So, as I said, this is actually related to Louis Couperin. I call it Couperin meets Pelogue. We have recorded a piece twice based on this Couperin fantasia. You'll hear the fantasia at the end, literally. But each time we do it, it evolves. So this is quite different from any previous version. But it's Couperin meets Pelogue, and he already challenged rhythm, as I said. This challenges plenty of other things. I think most of the things I've mentioned come under scrutiny, if not challenge.
Thank you so much, Roger, for such a fascinating talk. We have time for questions now, and there's a roaming mic. So if you have a question for Roger, we'd love to hear from you. And also the people that are watching online can ask questions in the chat. While you're getting the wheels turning on questions you might ask Roger. Roger, I thought I might start off with a question about our whether there's an ultimate bandwidth for our ability to remember scale degrees in these complex scale systems. Can we hold all of them in our mind, or at some point do the sounds start blurring together for us?
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's actually a group in Newcastle that studies that question, led by Scott Brown. They study it in a slightly different respect. It's called absolute pitch memory. So it's not about absolute pitch in the sense that we know about it in music. That is, can you reproduce an A without having heard any sound for a certain while? It's about, if you hear a set of pitches, how many of them can you identify as being item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And it turns out that even the most experienced professional musicians can only do about 12 or 13. So in a sense, that answers your question. But of course, in another sense, we know that we can tell all 88 keys on the piano apart. And so I think it's a very tricky one to answer. I think it is clear that there are sensory impacts which are detectably different to almost every pitch and every timbre, for that matter. But, you know, probably your question is really about, well, how practical are those differences, and how can they all be harnessed, or is there a limit? And I don't know. I think it's an empirical thing that people probably differ in.
Thank you very much, Roger. That was, as always, incredibly stimulating, bewildering, and exciting with all your work. I'm Peter McCallum, by the way. Had the pleasure of knowing Roger for many years. I was really interested in the model you had at the very beginning around composition, and I thought the way you talked about cognition, perception, the 5 parameters you listed, and then the cultural filters and how they emphasize those. But it did strike me that there is another element to music which you might crudely call the creation of subjective meaning. And that probably is part of perception, but to me it's a little bit beyond that. It's another level. And I think we all do create some sort of meaning, subjective meaning, and sometimes it's deeply subjective and deeply personal. Sometimes it's plainly culturally incompetent. If you, I don't know, insist on hearing a piece in 4/4 as though it was in 5/4 time, for example. But it's nevertheless, to me, something which is extremely important about music to almost everybody that I know. And I just wondered if your work or any other work had explored that element of things a bit.
Well, I think the way we've explored it is in the aspect of subjective meaning being affect. And we've explored that quite extensively. I haven't really taken an interest, because I think it's very difficult, in whether people can generate a narrative about a piece. There are a few studies of that, suggesting that it can be done, or that people sometimes are prone to do it. As you say, it's a very subjective thing, people vary. On the other hand, in the studies we did of affective response, so I'm only using that word affect because the way that we use emotion in psychology is overlapping, but it tends to want to say that emotion has a specifiable cause which can be resolved by the person, as opposed to a specifiable input, such as a piece of music. So we tend to, or I tend to prefer talking about affect there, but I think it is what you mean by subjective meaning. So of course subjective meaning is the most important thing probably there is about music, and it's one of the most difficult to get at because it varies. On the other hand, the last thing I was going to say, in the studies about affect that we did, at one point, fairly early on in the process, I was really interested in how people varied in that respect. And I published a paper where we had a group of people who were untrained in music, a group of people who were seriously trained in music, and a group of people who were specifically, not just seriously trained in music, but specifically trained in electroacoustic music. because I wanted to look at electroacoustic music as well as acoustic music. And the remarkable thing was that within each group there was huge variation, subjective variation as you say, but the overlap between the different groups and the commonality was even greater than that difference. So the groups were not that distinct because they were so variable, but the common pattern each group had was shared with the other groups. So in a way that said to me that there are certain kinds of music at least where there are a lot of commonalities. And that included both music that the participants were totally unfamiliar with, some Xenakis, for example, Bohor, the fantastic electroacoustic piece, and some pieces that they were at least familiar with the idiom of. I can't remember exactly which it was. It was either some Beethoven or some Dvorak. Very familiar genre at the least. So in a way that's encouraging, but at the same time there's certainly huge subjective variability, as you say.
Other questions?
Mine's going to be a very daggy question about Max and Max and Euclidean sequencing.
Yeah.
Do you see any like variables, like, or would you like modular synthesis?
Yeah.
Do you use that as opposed to Max, or
I've used Super Collider and I've used Gibber, but
voltage modular?
Pardon?
Voltage modular.
No.
Oh, okay. Oh no, just the way that you were describing the sequence that you created in Max. There's other ways that.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh no, I just find it interesting. That's all.
Yeah. There's lots of ways. I guess you're alluding to the possibility of doing it where things like spectral features drive rhythmic structure. Yeah, of course.
And the resulting timbral.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, one can do that within Max. One can choose one's platform for that, or Super Collider or whatever. I tend to prefer the digital platforms. It's a long time. In fact, I've never been serious about an analog synthesizer. So I started with the DX7.
But what DAW do you use? Do you use?
Yes, I usually use Pro Tools.
Okay.
And I'm also interested in Reaper.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's awesome.
Other questions?
I'm off the hook.
I did have one more question for you, Roger, before we adjourn for drinks outside. I started by introducing your long history of making music in this building. I'm wondering if you could take us through maybe the things that have changed the most for you making this new music, always new music, over the course of 30 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, initially I was, before the days of synthesizers and so on, I was interested very much in acoustic music. I mean, I still am, but I don't play so much of it now. And I did a lot of accompanying. I accompanied John Wallace for a long time, for example, the trumpet player. And so Lysis at that point played acoustic music, and we did Scalcotters and lots of Dutch music. And then we evolved into music with tape. And then as soon as it became available, electronic synthesizers, DX7, and then 1984 or so, Macintosh on the desktop, that made it equable to do electroacoustic music as well as acoustic music. And then also we changed our balance between performing composition and improvisation, which we had already done, progressively towards now almost entirely doing work which involves some improvisation. But we still present acousmatic, that is completely preformed electroacoustic pieces as well. And one of the most recent changes I made, which is going to be represented in our album that's just about to come out, Dueling, which will be on Earshift 85.
See, I got you to the plug.
Yes, thank you very much. One of the changes there, which was actually very interesting and did result in some difference, I always try to go for something different in an album, but I think this did succeed in that, was to use some preformed electroacoustic pieces which had been designed specifically for the purpose of improvising with. So in this case, it was ones that I wrote, but since we've commissioned some more and we're building up a repertoire, so that produces a different mindset about how you're improvising from either we have a form, we have a structure, we have a compositional material to improvise on. It's a different kind of compositional material. So I guess we've gradually evolved. And the other thing we've done is introduce multimedia, introduce text, introduce image, and integrate it, do things where we have synesthesia between the different elements, things where we have algorithms which act both on image and on text, well no, image and on sound. We've had separate algorithms that operate on text. So that's been a gradual transition too.
That's wonderful. So put that album on your shopping lists, and please join me in thanking Roger again.
Well done, Chris.
There'll be an opportunity for more informal questions over drinks and canapes outside. Please join us, and thanks again for attending tonight's lecture.